Welcome to The Explainer. It's easy to think of vegetarianism as a pretty modern thing, right? But what did the argument for it sound like way back before it hit the mainstream? Well, today we're going to time travel to 1956 and dive into this really passionate manifesto by Geoffrey L called Why Kill for Food? We're going to break down exactly how he built his case. Okay, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with Rudd's fundamental philosophy, then walk through his arguments about nature and health. After that, we'll see how he scales it all up to a global economic issue, and we'll wrap up by looking at how he took on his critics. You see, for Rudd, this was never just about what's for dinner. He kicks off his entire book not by talking about food, but by talking about a massive philosophical choice, a choice he thinks is the absolute cornerstone of a moral life. This quote, right from the preface, is basically his entire argument in one sentence. It's not just about skipping meat, it's about adopting a whole worldview built around one idea. Let's not cause unnecessary harm. This one ethical principle really drives everything else he's about to say. And that's the real key for Rudd. It all starts here. He truly believed that what you choose to eat is the first, most fundamental step toward a wider sense of moral responsibility. It's that moment where you decide, I'm going to try to build a better world, starting right there with your own plate. Okay, so once he's laid down that ethical foundation, Rudd asks this really interesting question. Does our own biology actually back this up? So he turns to comparative anatomy, kind of like a detective looking for clues in our own bodies. And here's where he lays out his evidence in this really clear side-by-side comparison. He's contrasting features from all across the animal kingdom. So for example, he points out that carnivores have short bowels to get rid of decaying meat super fast. But herbivores, they've got these long, winding bowels designed to slowly soak up every last nutrient. He even digs into saliva, noting that plant eaters have this enzyme, ptyalin, to digest starch, something carnivores just don't have. And this, of course, leads to his big question. Rudd argues that when you actually go down the list, long bowels, flatter teeth, a jaw that can move side to side for grinding, human anatomy lines up almost perfectly with the vegetarian column. For him, this was nature itself giving a thumbs up to a plant-based diet. Right, so after looking at anatomy, Rudd brings his argument much closer to home, our own personal health. Back in the 1950s, what did he claim a meat-based diet was actually doing to people's bodies? Well, he laid out a whole list of risks. He claimed meat encourages the wrong kind of bacteria in your gut, that it makes our bodies process an animal's waste products, and that it carries a risk of disease. And get this, he even points to cholesterol and animal fats as a factor in heart disease, which was a pretty forward-thinking concern for 1956. And to really hammer home that point about disease, he uses this powerful bit of evidence from his own time. He quotes a chief sanitary inspector from 1955, tapping into a very real public fear about what was, or more importantly, what wasn't being checked in the meat supply. And then he zooms way out, from the individual to society as a whole, to make a much bigger and, let's be honest, a much more controversial claim. He actually suggests there's a link between poor nutrition, what he called a diet of white bread and fish and chips, and juvenile delinquency. He argued it could actually impair a person's moral judgment. So, having made his case for our bodies and our society, Rudd goes even bigger. He expands his whole argument to a global scale. Now he's looking at the economics of feeding the world and just how efficiently we use our planet's resources. To start making this economic case, Rudd first tries to get you to wrap your head around the sheer scale of it all. He puts out this number, a staggering 10 billion, as his estimate for how many fish were being killed every single year for food, sport, and research. He wanted to make the cost of a meat-eating world just impossible to ignore. And this chart really gets to the core of his economic argument. Citing an expert from a famous agricultural station, Rudd claimed that it takes about 1.63 acres of good land to feed one person on a typical mixed diet. But for a vegetarian, it takes less than half that, only 0.6 acres. The inefficiency, he argued, was just off the charts. So all this leads him to his big economic conclusion. In a world with a growing population and only so much land, eating meat is an unsustainable luxury. He's presenting vegetarianism not just as a moral choice, but as the only logical, maybe even inevitable, solution to feeding everyone on the planet. So for his final section, Rudd basically anticipates what people are going to say. He takes on the common objections to his ideas head on, and he tries to systematically dismantle the arguments that were most often used against vegetarianism back in the 50s. First up, he tackles this classic justification, right? The idea that, hey, animals eat other animals in nature, so it's totally natural and okay for humans to eat meat too. He pushes back on this in two really smart ways. First, he says, hang on, most of nature isn't predatory. Most animals are plant eaters. And second, he argues that we humans have something animals don't, a moral compass. We shouldn't be imitating animal instinct. We should be living up to our own higher standards. Next, he moves on to what was, and, still is, a very common religious defense for eating meat. It's an argument rooted in a very specific reading of Scripture. But Rudd doesn't shy away. He goes right to the text. He argues that the word dominion really means guardianship or stewardship, not brutal exploitation. He brings up the simple, powerful command, "Thou shalt not kill." And then he points straight to Genesis chapter 1, where he says humanity's original diet is described as being completely plant-based. And there you have it. We've walked through the core arguments of Geoffrey Rudd's 1956 case for vegetarianism, from ethics and anatomy all the way to health and global economics. His passionate reasoning really leaves us with one big final question to think about. How do these ideas, forged nearly 70 years ago, actually hold up in the world we live in today?
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're looking back, way back, actually, to 1956, at a really comprehensive case for vegetarianism laid out in a book called Why Kill for Food?
That's right. And it's quite something, not just a pamphlet, It's this full spectrum argument trying to connect science, economics, philosophy, all from almost 70 years ago.
So our mission today is to kind of distill what this document was arguing. And the author, Geoffrey Rudd, doesn't really ease into it. I mean, right in the preface, he makes this big claim.
He really does. He basically says that a lack of reasoned thinking leads to chaos gangsters, business sharks, warmongers. Those are his examples.
And then he pivots straight to diet, saying vegetarianism is the, quote, necessary basis for any useful philosophy of life.
Pretty bold, very bold. He's essentially saying your diet is fundamental to your morality, and to understand that, we need their definition of vegetarian.
Okay.
The term itself was apparently coined in England in 1842 from the Latin vegetus, meaning whole, sound, fresh, lively. Simple definition back then. No flesh, fish, or fowl.
Right. With or without eggs and dairy was sort of secondary to the main point.
Exactly. And they didn't see it as new. They traced it back to Pythagoras, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, ancient roots. This wasn't a fad. It was a rediscovery for them.
Okay, let's unpack that. The core argument seems to start with our bodies, right? The physiological case in segment 1. Are we even designed for meat?
Yeah, that's the foundation. What's fascinating is how directly they tackle it using comparative anatomy. Anthropology back then suggested humans, as the terminal form of the hominoidea, were naturally frugivores.
Frugivores, fruit, nuts, tender shoots, that kind of thing.
Precisely. They argued eating flesh was a relatively recent detour, probably forced on us by things like the Ice Ages, an emergency measure, not the design spec.
And the evidence, they claim, is just us, our bodies. Put a human next to a true carnivore, and the differences are stark.
Absolutely stark. I mean, think about a lion or a wolf. Sharp claws, long canine teeth,
right.
Jaws that only move up and down for tearing and swallowing, and crucially, a very short bowel.
Why the short bowel?
To get toxic, decaying meat out of the system fast. Plus, their stomach acid is incredibly potent. We're talking strong enough to dissolve bone. They don't have tyolin in their saliva for starch digestion either.
Okay, so that's the carnivore setup. What about us? We've got these flat molars.
Exactly, designed for grinding. And our jaws move side to side laterally for pulping food. We have that tyolin enzyme in our saliva to start breaking down starches right away.
And the biggest difference, that bowel length. Much, much longer than a carnivore's.
Yeah, relatively speaking, it's very long. Great for slowly extracting nutrients from plants through fermentation. But the book's implication is stark. Put meat in that long, slow system.
And it starts to putrefy.
That's the argument.
Yeah.
It sits there, changes the gut bacteria towards predominantly putrefactive types, creating toxins. It puts a huge strain on a system not designed for it. They even mention finds like the Swanscombe skull, suggesting advanced human types existed long before Neanderthals, implying our basic form is ancient and adapted for plants.
So it's like running the wrong fuel in an engine and expecting it to run smoothly.
That's a perfect analogy for how they presented it. And this physiological argument leads directly into their concerns about health in the 1950s.
Right, segment 2. Health disease and what they saw as a food crisis. This is where it gets really interesting, connecting meat eating to widespread illness. What was the most, well, surprising claim?
For me, it's this idea of fear poisons. It's quite intense. They argued that the terror an animal feels right before slaughter floods its system with stress hormones.
Fear poisons. Wow. That sounds partly physiological, partly ethical, or even spiritual.
Definitely blurs the lines. They didn't have, modern cortisol assays back then, so it was partly observational, partly philosophical. But it connected to a more verifiable concern, decomposition.
Okay.
Putrefaction starts immediately upon death. Cooking kills the bacteria, sure, but the source warns about the dangerous toxic residue left behind. They linked over 90% of food poisoning cases back then to these germs, like salmonella.
And beyond immediate poisoning, they were worried about long-term disease, right?
Very much so. They mentioned greasy animal fats hindering calcium absorption. But here's where they were incredibly prescient. They flagged cholesterol in animal fats as a factor in coronary disease.
In 1956, that's decades before it became common knowledge.
Exactly. A major point. They also mentioned vitamin B12 deficiency possibly being linked to small amounts of meat toxins inhibiting the body's natural synthesis. And they didn't just stop at the meat itself.
The processing and agriculture concerns.
Yes. Urbanization meant more food processing, and they were worried about chemical agriculture, artificial fertilizers, insecticides, even systemic poisons absorbed by the plants animals ate.
They had specific examples too, didn't they? Something about flour and fluorine.
Right. Agene, a flour improver, which they said caused brain issues in dogs, and excess fluorine in water, baking powder, fertilizers linked to mottled teeth and even bone deformities. Real concerns about industrial food production.
Which naturally led them to critique the medical establishment of the day.
Oh, absolutely. They were quite critical of 1950s orthodox medicine. The view was doctors just ignored diet. Too much focus on wonder drugs, surgery, basically just suppressing symptoms, not fixing the root cause.
And they even waded into the polio vaccine debate. That must have been controversial.
Extremely. They questioned both its effectiveness and the ethics. Specifically, the massive number of monkeys required thousands sacrificing their kidneys, as they put it, for its production. A real critique of the animal testing model.
So lots of warnings. Did they offer any positive health evidence for vegetarianism?
Yes, they did. They cited observations like easier pregnancies, more resilient children with fewer common illnesses like tonsillitis, greater endurance in athletes, and longevity, mentioning some centenarian vegetarian sisters as examples.
Interesting. And even a link to behavior.
Apparently so. They connected poor diets, including meat-heavy ones, to delinquency, and claimed some experiments with raw food diets showed good psychological results. The overall message was clear. Diet isn't trivial, it's foundational.
So the physiological argument is powerful body not designed for it, leads to health issues. But the book stresses that the real core isn't anatomy, it's ethics, right? Segment 3.
Exactly. That's the pivot. The primary basis, Rudd argues, is ethical. Developing sensitivity, compassion, these are seen as markers of human progress. Slaughter requires suppressing those very qualities.
Killing cannot but breed callousness and irreverence for life. That's a direct quote, isn't it?
It is. And they backed it up with the scale of it all. The numbers are staggering, even for the 50s. 200 million cattle, 400 million sheep, 2 billion birds slaughtered annually worldwide based on their estimates.
Mind-boggling numbers.
And the argument is that this isn't just about the animals. It's inherently selfish, and it degrades the people who have to do the killing. It diminishes our collective humanity.
This leads into the vegetarian way of life idea.
Yes, living without causing unnecessary hurt. They pull in concepts like ahimsa, the nonviolence principle from Buddhism and Hinduism, the Taoist idea of the unity of all life, Confucian reciprocity, weaving it all together. Diet as applied ethics.
But writing for a Western audience in the 50s, they had to address Christianity directly, the common justification using the Bible.
They certainly did. They countered it by pointing to the Old Testament, arguing thou shalt not kill should be universal, highlighting bans on eating fat or blood, and crucially, citing Genesis, where God gives humans every green herb for meat.
So the original mandate was plants, in their view.
That's how they interpreted it. And for the New Testament, they noted that several early church fathers, Origen, Tertullian, even apostles like Matthew and Peter, according to some traditions, were vegetarians.
What about the tricky parts, like Jesus eating fish?
They tackle that head on. They discuss the Greek word for fish, ICHTHUS, pointing out it was also a well-known acronym, a kind of code for Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior.
Ah, the fish symbol.
Right, so they propose a scholarly interpretation.
Hmm.
Maybe those stories weren't literal dietary accounts, but mystical or symbolic references to Christ himself, understood that way by early followers. It's a way to reconcile the texts with a nonviolent ethic.
Okay, so we have anatomy, health, deep ethics, religious interpretations. It's incredibly thorough. How do they connect this to the bigger picture, like world problems? That brings us to segment 4, economics and sustainability.
Well, this was a huge concern post-war. Rising populations, they projected a doubling by 2000 AD and shrinking fertile land. Britain alone was losing 50,000 acres a year. It was a real crisis footing.
And meat production was seen as part of the problem.
A major part. The inefficiency was the core point. Raising cattle, for instance, took about 8 times more land than growing food directly for humans.
8 times. Wow.
Yeah, and only a tiny fraction of the food energy the animal eats actually becomes food energy for humans. It's an incredibly wasteful conversion process, like a leaky pipeline for calories and protein.
So the logical conclusion for them was
Vegetarianism as the logical solution to the world's food problem. Their figures were stark. The mixed diet needed about 1.63 acres per person per year, but a vegetarian one only needed 0.5 to 0.6 acres.
you could feed roughly 3 times as many people on the same land.
That was the math, yes. And they also busted the myth that meat was the best source of nutrition, pound for pound.
Oh, so?
They pointed out things like sirloin steak being nearly 60% water, whereas nuts or lentils are much denser in protein and calories. Peanuts, for example, only 4% water. They calculated a varied vegetarian diet could be up to 33% cheaper than a typical meat-inclusive diet back then.
Healthier, more ethical, and cheaper, and more sustainable. It's quite the pitch.
It really is.
So, to recap this deep dive, this 1956 book, Why Kill for Food, built this incredibly layered argument. It started with anatomy, our long gut isn't made for meat, then health warnings about toxins, disease, cholesterol chemicals, then ethics, compassion, ahimsa, the sheer scale of killing, and finally economics, land use, population pressure, and efficiency.
It's a fascinating historical snapshot showing these debates about diet, ethics, and sustainability were raging long before, the modern environmental movement really took off. It connects personal choice directly to global consequences.
And it loops back to that core philosophical challenge they laid out right at the start. We have the freedom to decide how we shall live, and how we live is the measure of our spiritual stature.
Yeah, that choice between the easy path and the perhaps more difficult but more principled path, it keeps coming back to that.
The source even suggests that failing to cooperate with nature, failing to live in harmony, could lead humanity down the path of extinction.
It does. It draws a parallel to other dominant species in Earth's history that ultimately vanished after achieving success through some exaggerated development, some specialization that became a dead end.
It's a bit of a chilling thought.
That leaves you wondering, doesn't it? Are our modern choices, our reliance on convenient but maybe unsustainable systems, reflecting that path of least resistance? Or are we capable of choosing that higher moral sense, that more conscious way of living they were advocating for all those years ago?